By the end of this decade, the United States automakers will do some combination of merging down to one company.
Say more about that.
China built 285 gigawatts of solar
Just this year.
in the first half.
I was in Europe over the summer. The BYD is a great car. It's better than a Tesla.
My oldest child is 10 years old. He's never going to have to drive. We're dramatically underestimating how this is going to affect society.
How has being a climate VC changed in the last year?
The amount of power that's being consumed by AI is just staggering compared to in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years.
When it comes to China, where do you feel like we're underestimating or underreacting?
One that I think is really interesting is
Hey climbers, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Climb. Today, I'm so thrilled to have my friend Matt Eggers, who is Managing Director of Prelude Ventures. Prelude is a climate-focused fund with over $2 billion under management and great investments like Luxwall, Terrabase, Augmenta, and Graphite. Matt has spent his career across companies like Sunrun, Tesla, and Bloom Energy, and now backs founders who are building the energy and infrastructure stack for the new AI era, from new power for data centers to first-of-a-kind manufacturing. In this conversation, we're going to dig into AI's demand on the grid, the difference between power and energy, how to finance hard climate projects, and why it matters to have empathy on your cap table. Matt, I'm so thrilled to have you on the show today.
pleasure to be here.
So why don't we start with this? We are talking just a week or so ahead of the first anniversary of Trump's second term. How has being a climate VC changed in the last year?
It has changed, indeed. But before I say how it's changed, I just want to say that we've seen this before. This is actually not the worst downturn that I've seen in climate tech and this sort of investing. That was clearly 2008 through 2012.
Yeah.
Much harder times than we are here. And, you might ask why. These are massive industries now. EVs are a giant industry. Solar is a giant industry. Wind is a giant industry. Energy efficiency continues to roll on. So these are really big, really important industries, and they don't just go away because somebody in the White House doesn't like them. Now, there's bright sides and dark sides to how things have changed under Trump. Obviously, he took away a lot of elements of the IRA. We still have more government support than we did pre-IRA, which is another important positive point of it. But it's less. And there's also just been sort of a pall cast by the zeitgeist that Trump has spread, which just is kind of a vibe thing. But there is less support for some industries. For solar, there's less support for certain types of energy efficiency. And oddly enough, there's less permitting support in certain places. You would think that we would be supporting permitting in every sort of way because Trump and Republicans generally want to build. It's not the case. There's very public examples. Take the Grain Belt Express, a huge transmission line that was completely permitted and ready to be built from very cheap, very available wind in Kansas and that part of the country through to the central Midwest where there's many tens of millions of people. And the Trump administration, out of the blue, in a complete shock, killed it.
How does that change the way you think about what's investable, right? The availability of downstream capital was the first thing I noticed that changed in the past year.
Yeah.
The funds that were climate funds post-IRA are suddenly defense funds or reindustrialization funds. How do you think about what you invest in differently as a result of that?
Part of it is if a company is getting incentives or some sort of special permitting treatment or favor from the government in any sort of way, tax credits, there's added risk added to that now because people don't feel like they can rely on the word of the government, which is unfortunate. I think there's also, some things are better, right? The government's pouring money into certain aspects of power and supporting companies there. So if you are in favored segments of the power industry, you're getting a huge amount of support from the government. Critical minerals, another place where getting huge amount of supports from the government. One of the challenges, businesses like predictability, and so it's just reduced predictability. So it's reduced the amount that investors can rely on certain forms of government support.
I think that was the toughest thing about the tariffs. He started with this number, then there was a pause, then it came back, then it's on copper, now it's not on copper. And I'm not even thinking about startups who are building this. I just think about, entrepreneurs in the middle of the country who are thinking about how do I buy my feedstock and how do I cost it out and what do I offer my downstream customers? It's so hard to plan as a business.
It's hard to plan, even for large companies, not just small businesses. For big companies, if you're buying $1 billion worth of grain from somewhere and the tariffs are going up and down and up and down, you have a real difficult time planning for cash, planning for expenses, and so forth.
Where have you seen AI demand and its intersection with energy and climate show up either in your portfolio or in the companies that you're seeing in the pipeline?
Well, I mean, the power sector is booming in a way it hasn't really in my lifetime. Certainly not since the late 80s, early 90s. AI is a massive driver of that. Of course, there's some reindustrialization of the US that's happening, which is a great thing. That's a driver of that. But the amount of power that's being consumed and being asked for by AI is just staggering compared to power growth in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years.
Yeah. Do you think that is a problem that startups are equipped to solve, or are we dealing with such archaic systems like the grid and utilities companies that as a longtime VC, those are industries that most folks say long sales cycles, concentrated buyer group, avoid.
Yeah. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. I mean, there are ways that startups are able to address that. Clearly, geothermal is doing really well right now. There's a bunch of companies building different geothermal technologies. Prelude's an investor in one called Quays. That's a great place to be right now.
Okay.
It's a 24/7 source of power. It's clean. People like it. There are lots of companies that are coming out with different ways and methods to try to make the grid run smoother. One thing that I think people that are a little bit close to power industries, but not real close, misunderstand is it's not about energy right now. It's about power.
Okay, explain the distinction.
Yeah, so energy is measured in a kilowatt hour. It's power over time. Power is instantaneous need for energy. The reason that's important is we have a lot of energy and not enough power. And the power is at certain times of day. The demand from peak energy to trough energy is huge, that swing. A data center is both good and bad for the grid because it operates 24/7, 365. At night, that actually makes energy cheaper for everybody. For homeowners, for businesses, all power costs go down because you're running more through this system that you've already bought and paid for. So it actually lowers costs for everybody. Except during the day when power is most in demand, and that might be 20, 30, 40 hours a year are particularly the hard ones, then power prices go crazy high. And data centers actually make that worse because they just add to that peak a little bit. So there's lots of software companies trying to figure out how to shift loads in data centers or make them run more efficiently or shift loads elsewhere. We've got a portfolio company, Voltus, that's in this sort of industry demand response. It's been around for a long time and their business is booming right now because a lot of folks are willing to reduce their big businesses can scale back their use of power at certain times and make a lot of money doing it.
Yeah. Let's double click on that kind of power availability problem. If we look at the aspects of, where the grid has seen challenges historically, is it generation? Is it transmission, interconnection, or something else?
Yeah, it's actually all of those things. When you think about adding capacity to the grid, there's a whole lot of ways you can do it. Interconnection is just getting connected to the grid, getting the utility to say, yes, you can use this much power under the profile you're wanting. So it depends on those other things you mentioned, generation and transmission. Sometimes you could solve the problem completely with transmission because there's a lot of power over here and not enough over here, and you can just connect the two with a transmission line, like the Grain Belt Express that we were talking about. But eventually you just have to keep adding more power to the grid. And it also matters when you add the power to the grid, and we could talk more about the intermittency of solar and how that can be solved and so forth.
Well, you touched on that, so let's talk about that, right? So these days I feel like nuclear has become the darling, and you're seeing hundreds of millions of venture dollars going into this category. And I'm sitting here still as a believer in solar and wind. Am I a hopeless quixotic optimist, or is that something where we can still rely on solar and wind as a source of this power that we need in the AI boom era?
China built in the first half of 2025, they built 285 gigawatts of solar.
Just this year?
In the first half, in half a year.
Wow.
So they're on pace for more than 500 gigawatts of deployed solar in 2025. Trump likes to call these incentives the Green New Scam. And I keep scratching my head and being like, is she just that in the pocket of the tree huggers? Is the chairman of China that in the pocket of the tree huggers and the panda lovers or something, that he's doing this for them? I don't think so. So solar is the cheapest and fastest, emphasis on fastest, because the hyperscalers are in a massive race to get the way to get power on the grid.
Yeah.
a nuclear power plant is a gigawatt. So at peak production, just in solar, in half a year, China added 285 nuclear power plants to their grid. Amazing. You do have to spread that power around certain times, but again, the peak capacity of the grid is much bigger than the rest of the capacity of the grid. And batteries, for example, can extend that capacity. They can extend it 4 hours, 8 hours. They can't extend it 24 hours yet. But there are other ways then to provide peaking power. There's peaking gas plants, for example. So it's it's a very complex machine, and solar is still the fastest and cheapest way to add energy. And then we have to figure out other ways to make that energy fit into them.
Well, you referenced the intermittency problem, right? So that's kind of the thing that the detractors of solar, to give them their day in the sun, let's say that they typically say, well, the problem with the sun is it doesn't shine at night. Problem with the wind is it doesn't always blow. But data centers need a reliable source of energy, or in your case, I guess you're saying power. Does that still make sense in a world where we expect AI power demand to potentially triple in the next decade?
It does, because even if AI power demand triples, it'll still be quite a small proportion of the grid. And the rest of the grid isn't 24/7. It fluctuates and goes down with the weather, the time of day, the temperature, and those sorts of things. And we can plan for that. We know that that's going to happen. Decades of watching the power go like this. That's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So solar adds cheap energy that then we can add cheap batteries to shift some of it, but it doesn't solve all the problem, but it solves a huge portion of the problem. The other thing that I think about what China probably has in mind as they do this, there's a fundamental economic principle that when you give people a lot of a cheap, valuable resource, they figure out how to use it. And so when you're building 285, let's say 550 nuclear power plants worth of energy during the day, a year, that's really a lot of cheap power. That'll advance battery capabilities really fast. That'll advance these demand response capabilities for allowing businesses and manufacturers that can shift power when it's profitable to do so. When we have all that power, we'll figure out how to use it.
Yeah. One of the things I really like about following you on LinkedIn especially is you compare and contrast where our U.S. policies are contrasting with China's policies. Where do you think both investors and policymakers overreact when it comes to China? And where do you feel like we're underestimating or underreacting?
I feel like we're underestimating them in almost every way.
Really?
Right now. I was shocked, maybe researchers in the space weren't, when they released, the AI tool, DeepSeek.
DeepSeek moment, yes.
6 months ago. I was shocked when I saw 285 gigawatts. They're flooding the world with cheap EVs, very well-built cars.
The BYD, I was in Europe over the summer. That is a great car. It's better than a Tesla. I hate to put that on record, but it is a really well-built car.
It is a really well-built car, and the range is terrific. Everything about it is great. I don't know. I can't think of, maybe space is a sector where we're quite a bit ahead of China. They still can't build an airplane that competes with the 787. So there are these select sectors, but I wouldn't bet against them on anything right now.
Yeah. As an investor, when you think about the global scale of the solutions that you're investing in, how much of that geopolitical concern factors into it? Or is that not a risk at the stage that you really think about?
It's not a risk that we really think about. I mean, I wouldn't encourage a seed stage founder to be worrying too much about China. Make a product that people need in the markets that are big enough to support your company, and you're going to do great.
Coming back to this piece of the data center demand, right? What technologies are you seeing, whether in your portfolio or in the pipeline, that are best situated to address that gap between the power needed and the power being created?
Let's see. I think one that I think is really interesting, especially as we've spent some time talking about the power difference between power and energy and the peak need, is probably Form Energy.
Okay.
Form Energy makes large stationary grid connected batteries that act as a peaker plant. So they're shifting 100 hours of power at a time. They won't get called on every day. This isn't like a lithium-ion battery attached to your home solar system that you run every night for 4 hours. These are things that compete with gas peaker plants. So it might only run, on the order of hundreds to 1,000 hours a year. Form's now starting to deploy those batteries. And in this age of this power crunch, those are incredibly valuable products. They can compete with a gas peaker plant on cost of power.
Is it the way to think about it like a backup generator for when we have exhausted the cheaply available power here, this is the reserve you draw on, and then you fill it back up.
Yeah, that's a reasonably good way to think about it. And then you fill it back up when power is cheap and plentiful on the grid, and then you send that power back out when it's not.
You've made a couple investments like that. I mean, I looked at copper, for example. That was one that my friends at Voyager had sent me some time ago, and it was a kind of similar idea. Is that a theme in your sense, where you're trying to figure out how you smooth out the power demand curve?
It is a theme because, again, I think there's so much opportunity there. It's easier to smooth it out than it is to, especially in this country where it's unfortunately still hard to build stuff, than it is to build new stuff. And it's not just the permitting that makes it difficult to build new stuff, but the supply chain crunch. It takes 5 years to get a new combined cycle gas turbine right now. There's a 5-year wait list. So we can't just add power. I think you mentioned nuclear. I think nuclear is exciting. I've said since I started in climate tech 20 some years ago that if I was king of the world, we'd build another 100 nuclear power plants in the US. It's just hard to get it done. So we like things like copper is really interesting. In particular, it addresses some aging aspects of the grid and the grid behind the meter. So one of their target markets, these little niches are so interesting, is cities like New York, like old northeastern cities, where both the gas infrastructure and the electrical infrastructure in these 100-year-old buildings is in bad shape.
Yep.
So there are many, many buildings in New York where at some point someone smelled gas, they call Con Ed, Con Ed shows up with a gas sniffer, is like, yep, there's gas, and they shut off the gas to the building. So someone's sitting there and in a condo that they paid $5 million for, and they don't have gas, and they have a gas range. So then they go to Target and buy a $25 induction heat plate, and that's how they're cooking in their $5 million condo. People don't like that. The solution then is for the building to replace the entire gas infrastructure in the building. Very expensive, very invasive. Or to install induction stoves, you can get around that. You have to replace the entire electrical infrastructure because you need so much power. In comes copper with a battery, and they just smooth out that high power demand in the stove. You charge the battery overnight, and then it covers the high demand. So it just makes it look like you can plug it into a 120 volt outlet. You don't need to upgrade the power system.
You know, the thing that I didn't get about it, and again, you know, you're in venture long enough, you pass on things you still think are really good ideas, is people. The citizens of New York that are so used to their gas stoves now having to switch over to, induction. That was the thing that I couldn't get over, which is how are you going to convince the 70-year-old citizens of the Upper East Side that, hey, suddenly now we're moving everything over to induction. And yes, I know that there's some regulation and things that were kind of around that, but as we've realized, regulations change with election cycles. And now with the new mayor, who knows? And maybe with the next mayor, who knows? I'm curious how you thought about these risks as you were going through your evaluation process.
Of copper in particular? Yeah. Well, have you tried an induction stove before?
Yeah, I think in an Airbnb once. Yeah.
Okay.
They're good. I mean, nothing.
I think they're great.
Yeah.
I think people will come to really like them. I think they actually cook much better and easier to use. And then the second thing is you go to that 70-year-old on the Upper East Side and you turn off their gas because the gas is leaking in the building. And you tell them, okay, it's going to be $25,000 per condo to fix your gas. And they say, okay, I'll take an induction.
Yeah. So it's really meeting them at the point of the need.
It's meeting them at the point of the need. And there are tens of thousands of those units and likely to be, many more, hundreds of thousands over the next period of time of those sorts of units in the Northeast. And by then, you go to your neighbor's house and they're like, I love my new induction stove.
Yeah.
And, then
the word of mouth.
Yeah, these things start to spread. We've got a company, we may talk about it again, but Luxwall.
Yeah.
That makes these extraordinarily efficient windows. They're still more expensive than a double pane, although the BOM cost is actually lower than a double pane, so will eventually maybe even be cheaper than a traditional double pane. Windows are the main source of energy loss outside of a building. That's why you have to keep the heat running. The heat escapes. Most of it escapes out the windows. This basically shuts off that loss, this technology, and it makes the space so much more comfortable and much more quiet. The company is doing an install right now at a building at like 86th and Broadway, a big multifamily apartment building, and they installed a few units. Someone came to one of those units and was blown away by how quiet it was, and now they're demanding that they get it in their unit because they're like, we have a kid, and this is like the sound. There's no sound.
Yeah. One of the things that I think was so interesting about this last 4 years of climate investing is the number of VCs that said, Jay, I'm a software-only climate investor. And one of the things I liked about looking at the Prelude portfolio ahead of our conversation today was seeing your willingness to take hardware, manufacturing, first-of-a-kind risk. Before we dive into some of the ways that you advise your companies to manage, the financing of that work, I'd love your take on, can there be software-only VCs in climate tech, or is that, a setup to fail?
I would say there definitely can be. I mean, I don't know what the exact breakdown, but I'd probably say 20-25% of our companies are software.
Okay.
So there's a good portion, to many people, it's shocking how many hardware companies there are, but, there's a lot of software. Software can do a lot of good in climate tech too.
Okay. Now, coming back to the hardware piece, there seems to be a need for a blended approach with these companies, because what we saw was equity financing really only went so far. You've been really vocal about the need for a split between equity financing and capital project financing. Explain that difference to people and how you advise your companies to evaluate the capital stack at different stages of their growth.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's one of the big challenges of building a hardware company is layering in these different sorts of capital and getting to the right risk reduction at the right time so that the early investors can still generate venture returns. That's sort of the crux. And it comes down to equity versus debt. Most people know debt is much, much cheaper on a return demand basis than equity, but debt holders can't afford to lose their money.
Yeah.
Similar to late stage growth investors, they can't afford to lose money very often, or it doesn't work. So companies need to figure out how to quickly tackle the hard problems first and reduce risk so their valuation keeps going up, and be able to plan what are the right steps in terms of pilot size to first plant size to a major commercial plant size so they can get the right risk reduction for the layer of capital that comes in. Typically, you can't get project finance on a first-of-a-kind plant, and that's where the real challenge is. And there's no magic necessarily to get around that, other than thinking really carefully about how you reduce risk before that, so that the equity backers still have plenty of capital to put in a big slice of equity into that first plant.
Okay, so maybe I'll challenge that a little bit. Efficient capital theory would say the moment there is a gap in the market for something, some enterprising entrepreneur will go and raise a fund to back it. And yet, to me, there's always felt like this chasm in the first of a kind. You've got a pilot that's working, you've taken some equity capital to do it. To then go and build a plant or do that first of a kind, it would take such a dilutive quantum of capital that you don't necessarily want to do it, but you're still far away from project financing.
Yeah.
Why do you feel like there hasn't been this capital first of a kind wave of funding when there's clearly such a need for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. It just depends on the sector.
Right.
So some of the places where it's been really painfully obvious that there isn't over the last few years, cement, for example, or in the US in like liquid fuels, it's been a really hard space to cross that chasm. Partly it's because the products you're competing against are so perfected and so cheap that it's really difficult to get there even on that first plant. This is a place where government incentives can help. That's what's happening in Europe, for example, where they're building a lot more stuff in the liquid fuel space than we are. But there are other segments of the market where that's not the case, where there are investors who are happy to take that risk to build factories. Form Energy, we talked about. Investors have spent hundreds of millions, near on billions, building that factory, pre-revenue, because they believe in the market opportunity, and the product is incredibly competitive in this massive market.
Is there a archetype of founder that you feel like succeeds at crossing that first-of-a-kind chasm? Or is it really just a matter of product being able to deliver?
Yeah, I think it's both, but I think you need a founder who is both incredibly into the details and very believable about their skill set and how it relates to building that factory or that plant and operating it. So they've got very relevant experience, and they've got an extraordinary vision that can continue to get investors to help part with their money to support that. There's a bunch of those out there that have had success stories. Mining is a sector right now.
Okay.
That's sort of a new one that lots of investors are pouring money into that you wouldn't have thought 10 years ago VCs are going to invest in a whole bunch of mining. But there's some great founders that have come into the space. There's been a few companies that are starting to get success. Prelude invested in one 8 or so years ago called MindSense. Crazy tech. They took an XRF sensor that used to have to be, you use them in a lab and you would have to It would be on equipment that isolated it from any vibrations in the floor as people walked by. That's how sensitive the technology was to working right. They figured out how to build it so it could be in a massive copper mining shovel. You know, the kind of shovels that could pick up this whole building we're sitting in right now and move it. And it can, in a second or two, tell the operator of the shovel how much copper is in that pile of ore.
Wow.
Because, you know...
How long did that process take before? I mean, hours, right? To go through.
Well, they didn't know. Oh. They would evaluate this segment of rock in the mine and say, there's enough copper, we're going to process this piece. Oh, this next layer, there's not much copper, so we won't process it. But, you know, veins of copper don't follow the rules. Yeah. So, of course, you get some scoops in the good part that have very little copper, and you get some scoops in the bad part that have lots of copper. And before, you processed a lot of waste and you dumped a lot of good copper. With this technology, you don't do that. And they still wear out really fast, but they're so valuable, they just keep replacing them and put them in these big shovels. Anyway, there's been now lots of additional mining companies getting backed. Why? You know, why do venture investors? Partly because that market is so big. People suddenly discovered that copper was, you know, one of the largest markets on Earth, for example. And with all the data center boom and EVs, all this electrification of our world in all ways, it all runs on copper.
Yeah.
So demand is expected to double, and the world has no way to do that without new technology.
Well, in the U.S. specifically, I think imports 2/3 of the copper that's used here and makes less than a third of it.
Yeah.
And you know, this is interesting you bring up copper because I've been spending time thinking about on the other end, the recycled end of copper.
Yeah.
And actually thinking about what are all the techniques that are not being used to recover what is already being lost in, you know, whether it's recycled batteries,
black mass.
Yeah, totally. And who's actually doing that work, right? And is there a roll-up strategy there? Is it a technology play? Like, there's probably some things to do here, but the one thing that's not in dispute is that the demand is far outstripping the supply.
That's right. And, you know, investors like that there is some commodity price variation, but there's no risk. There's no real risk to that demand. If you can make copper 25% below what the prices are today, you know you're going to be able to sell a lot of copper for a very long time.
Yeah.
You know, we talked before, sometimes you're betting on consumer tastes, and who's got a better idea of consumer taste? Jay, Matt, obviously some people have really good sense of that. I don't know.
Right. Coming back to Luxwall, which I thought was a pretty interesting company in your portfolio. Honestly, given the simplicity of it too, I think sometimes we think about climate solutions as being these heavily technical, you know, factories or whatever. And it's glass panes. And yes, there's technology involved in it, but it's something as simple as, okay, it's a 1-for-1 replacement. Maybe I'm oversimplifying it. What was it about that pitch or conversation when they came in that, you know, convinced you that this was the right founder and product to bet on?
Yeah, it's interesting the way you described it. I think you were both right and not right in that the end product is really simple, which is a great thing, and making it and figuring out how to make it is very complex.
Okay, tell me more.
But the factory itself is not that expensive to build. The technology is in the materials of the seal. So what it is, it's 2 panes of glass, just like a double pane, but there's a 10 to the minus 6 torr, basically like outer space vacuum between these 2 panes. And outer space is really cold because there's nothing to absorb heat. And so if you don't have any material in between the panes, energy doesn't transfer through in the traditional ways that it escapes windows. That CEO had a lot of experience in the glass industry, both developing new products and manufacturing, bringing them to market, selling them. He knew the entire business, which was really attractive. A lot of the hard parts were in the seal and a few machines and ways to make it, but to develop the factories wasn't actually that extraordinarily expensive. I mean, it's still on the order of many tens of millions, but not hundreds.
Yeah.
So we liked all of those things about it. And like you said, like the product is simple for the market to adopt. They really like it. It's a huge industry, $35 billion a year of glass in the United States alone. This is a thing I love about businesses is when there's a core market that already exists and they can create a new segment in the market.
Yeah.
Their new segment is a single pane replacement without tearing out the frame. So, you know, if you break the glass in your office or your house, it's not a construction project. No one comes and rips a hole in your wall, takes out the whole frame, spends 3 or 4 days putting it back in just to replace glass. They can just replace the glass. Yeah. Today, you can't do that to take a single pane from a double pane because it won't fit in the pocket. This technology fits in that pocket. We've created this whole new market of single pane replacements without a construction project. So it lowers the cost and it doesn't disrupt the tenants. That I love that. That's like a magic new business that never existed.
I think the market adoption piece that you touched on is one that I look at from a lens a lot, which is how close to a one-to-one is this? How much education is needed in the market? Given that we work with our founders on brand media and storytelling, that's obviously a consideration that we have, right? How easy is it going to be for somebody to take, let's say in the concrete world, take a mix that they were using for so many years and use a new material in it? We learned very quickly, folks have been doing something for 40 years, to convince them to use a cementitious material replacement and then be able to trust the engineering and be able to put it into production. And by the way, you have the physics issue, which is concrete takes 28 days to set. It's those kinds of things that don't know if enough investors gave thought to in this last wave of climate investing. And, there's, when you're working in the world of atoms, like things like physics and time and engineering risk really, really matter.
They all really matter. I think sometimes the investors in the space didn't give enough weight to the difficulty of changing those habits. I think the value needs to accrue to the customer. It needs to be obvious to them that they're getting the value, and it needs to come in a relatively quick time frame. And so I worry about, an improvement of a cement that's going to make the cement last 10 or 20 years longer. Great for civilization, horrible for your customer who doesn't care.
Yeah.
Does the customer care? Is the user, is the person buying it going to get more value? Is it going to grow that person's business, for example? The sound benefit, the noise benefit of Luxball is one of those things that I was excited about at the seed stage because I thought, wow, people are going to walk in there and they're going to like this immediately. Yeah. And they don't even need to look at their heating bill.
Yeah, the value is in the heating bill, but the time to value is actually coming from the sound.
The sound. And actually it makes the space more comfortable too, because you don't feel heat or cold radiating from the window. So people are more comfortable.
It's pretty interesting. If a founder comes to you with a, game plan that is infrastructure heavy, requires capital investment, and they put that model in front of you, what are the 2 or 3 things that you're really looking for to stress test their assumptions?
Yeah, margins is a big one. You've got to be able to, if you're going to spend a lot of money without being able to get into the market and prove it, you really have to believe that ultimately the product's going to make a lot of money.
Is there a floor for that margin profile that you look at? Does it vary?
It varies. It depends on how big the market is and how much capital has to get spent. And, I think sometimes it surprises people that a software company could go raise $400 or $500 million just to scale sales and marketing, and people that aren't in that industry will scratch their heads at that. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's 85% gross margin. You can spend a lot on salespeople when it's 85% gross margin and it recurs. So that's why software is such a beautiful business model. Not a lot of things in hard tech are 85% gross margins, but they can be good gross margins. They can be 50, 60%. And they could also have a high operating margin because it doesn't take much sales and marketing. So sometimes the gross margin can be a little bit lower, but the final EBIT or EBITDA margin on the company can still be pretty attractive because, you're selling through a channel and the channel's making a lot of money on the product or something. Yeah. So you don't have to spend much on sales and marketing. There's not competition. Maybe you've got IP. And so that will block out any sort of competition. So once you get in the market, you've got a lock.
Very sticky. Yeah.
Those are the sort of things that I'll look at sounds like you're asking about a financial model to try to see, do I think this can be a big return? Ultimately, public investors pay for margin and growth. That's it.
So you're at the seed stage, you're already thinking about, is this company, when it rings the bell at the NYSE, are they going to have the margin profile that gets a public investor excited?
Margin and growth. Yeah.
Yeah.
And lots of things layer into that. Obviously, the total market size layers into growth. Yeah. If you're already 40% of a market, you're not going to grow fast. If you're 0.4% or 0.04% of the market, you've got a lot of room to grow. So different things matter hugely within that, but that's what they pay for.
Yeah. When you see where the capital is being deployed today by our peers, obviously AI and, AI native companies seem to be pulling a lot of mind share and capital share. How do you feel about getting the companies in your portfolio, or just let's speak more broadly about companies in climate funded in that environment where
we just stick AI at the end of the name?
Yeah, put a .ai at the end of the... No, I mean, in reality, I see this with our companies too, where they go, I tell them, you're going to speak to a Series A investor who earlier that day spoke to somebody that went from 0 to 20 million ARR. and you're great. You hit 5 million, but it took you 3 years to get there. To me, it feels like there needs to be two different kinds of investors entirely, because how the hell can you back both companies when you're looking at two very, very different growth profiles?
Yeah.
Do you feel that, or am I just
I do.
alone in that? Okay.
No, I feel that. I certainly do. And there are different kinds of investors for these different sorts of companies with different mandates and different skill sets that they're trying to apply.
But we're all in this field called venture capital, and we're all raising from the same LPs, and we're all promising roughly the same return profile in the same timeline, but we're approaching it from very different angles. I guess that's what I'm trying to square the circle on, which is all these companies are going to the same Series A funds, and yet the path to which they get to that IPO is very different.
Yeah, that's true. But AI, we talked about some of the things AI needs. It needs power. It needs critical materials. We need these other things. There are other markets that are also very attractive right now, things that deal with defense or resilience. It's surprising the number of our companies right now who have a side thing that they're getting asked to do by the Department of Defense.
Really?
Yeah.
Just from an energy, because the DoD has energy needs.
Well, it could be energy, or it could be, someone's developed a very cheap, super efficient, large drone. And the Department of Defense is like, wow, we need to move huge amounts of cargo cheaply, and how the range and the efficiency getting fuel to the front lines is very, very difficult. So that's an incredibly attractive thing. A lot of things in hard tech have other uses.
Yeah.
And for a while, that wasn't something that the U.S. was thinking a lot about. And actually, it was kind of a good thing, right? There was a peace dividend. We didn't need to worry about that. We're not in that world as much right now. And so now we're much more interested in taking domestic technology and applying it to defense. 30, 40 years ago, it was the other way around, right? We developed a lot of this technology for defense, and then we applied so much of it to the domestic economy. There's dozens and dozens of things that were invented for defense that then got out. Now,
so the space race being a good example, right? All the great things that came out of the Sputnik moment.
Yeah.
And I think as climate investors, a lot of folks looked for that Sputnik moment in climate. I feel like it might still be coming. You talked about, China's development of gigawatts of solar. Do we need a Sputnik moment like that to get more people shifting the dial back from, AI native to these large problems?
Yeah, it sure would help, but I do think it's happening already. And then there's the knock-on effects of AI, rising power prices, which have played a large role in the last set of elections a few weeks ago, and probably will again next year. When power prices start to go up, other technologies start to look a whole lot more valuable. Box wall windows, the ROI just keeps going up as the power prices and energy prices go up. Copper stoves, all these sorts of things that make energy use more efficient elsewhere get more valuable. Mm-hmm. It is something that's going to grow 500% year over year into perpetuity. Is hard to compete with, but there are lots of other good places to make a lot of money in venture capital too.
Yeah. Last thing on this topic, when you're looking at the companies presenting to you or in your pipeline, does it shift your thinking? Just being like, hey, this is the game on the field, right? And instead of looking at something that is going to have 3 years pre-revenue, I can look at this other company that's going to hit 10 million ARR this year. Does it shift your focus?
Well, you do have to play the game on the field.
Yeah.
Bill Gurley, wasn't he famous for saying that?
Yeah.
You have to play the game on the field. So things like, it's not my first choice to have my company selling to the Department of Defense for war fighting. If there are great uses there and that's going to support the company, we never tell them not to do that. They should go do that. They should pursue that opportunity. It also can actually be very friendly from a climate perspective as well, or helpful. So, we also think about how do we use AI in this company that's not an AI company to take advantage of it so that we can compress the development time, shorten the development times, reduce the amount of capital, get to market faster, hire fewer people.
What's an example of that? I love that as a use case. Is there somebody in your portfolio that's doing it really well?
Absolutely. So one of my companies, Vaulted Deep, is a company it's a CDR and a waste management company. Okay. They inject biosolids, which is what's left over after wastewater treatment. It's that kind of waste. Yeah. Also manure, toxic paper sludge, all kinds of other cattle manure. We've got so many cattle. Yeah. So there's all kinds of this waste that piles up. It's expensive to dispose of. They can inject it 5,000 feet underground, essentially reverse frack it, which gets rid of the waste and removes all the toxicity And that waste is mostly carbon at that point. So then they get carbon credits. So they've got a huge contract with Microsoft and Google and a bunch of other folks for that carbon storage. They're like an oil company in that they have to find the right geology and drill in the right way and so forth. So as they're searching for new sites, new disposal sites for this, it takes a lot of work of understanding the data on the geology, understanding the permitting infrastructure, knowing where the waste is and how much it'll cost to transport. It's this huge multifactorial problem. It was taking them 5 or 6 months to get to decision to permit a site. Now it's taking 6 weeks because they figured out the process, and they're just cranking through it better, but they're just applying a lot of...
They can make it programmatic.
They can make it programmatic with a lot of AI tools to crank through that data and do what humans would take months to do in weeks. That's a use case. I mean, obviously, many of our companies, even if they're not software companies, they're writing software, whether it's software that goes inside a controller, firmware or something on their piece of hardware, software to run a piece of factory equipment, some software interface that a user has to use. Practically every company writes a lot of software these days, so they're using AI to make that piece go faster and be better. So there's quite a few of those examples that I think, that AI boom is helping all these companies spend less money.
Yeah, I think it's also helping in a lot of use cases in the real world of whether it's customer service or it's just managing workloads, creating kind of agentic use cases inside of a company. I'm seeing that even with businesses that are non-AI in the senses they don't consume AI tokens for every interaction with the customer. I think if you're a founder today and you're not using these tools inside of your business to go faster or to do more with fewer employees, I think you're getting left behind.
You totally are. Yeah. And I've encouraged my founders to, in interviews with everyone they're hiring, a question should be, how are you using AI to make yourself better in your job?
That's great.
And if the person doesn't have a good answer to that, that's a big issue.
You talked about the importance of being non-consensus in a largely consensus VC world. What's a recent non-consensus investment that you made that you feel like most folks, passed on or didn't totally understand?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Vaulted. So I made 2 CDR investments last year, Vaulted and Graphite.
Yeah.
I'd never made a CDR investment personally before, and CDR, carbon dioxide removal. That's sort of a market, especially in the Trump era, that people aren't really as excited about. And as capital got more expensive and so forth, a lot of money over the last 2-3 years was fleeing from CDR. So why did I make 2 investments? One, these companies are storing it with biogenic sources. They're so-called bikers, bioenergy or biomass-based storage. Plants grow for free. It does not take a lot of money to make that happen. And in fact, there's a huge amount of waste biomass that just naturally happens, whether it's from agriculture or from forestry or so forth. There's this stuff and it's free, usually, or low cost. These companies have figured out ways to take that waste. They actually remove a waste problem and generate carbon storage. So they're not doing carbon storage only for carbon storage's sake. And their costs look extremely cheap to me without any massive leap in technology, no miracles, not even any engineering miracles, let alone a science miracle. They're executing today. They're storing carbon now at reasonable volumes. And finally, they're really scalable. We talked about how hard it is to raise in this environment $300-400 million to go build a plant.
Yeah.
They have projects that cost $5 million, $10 million, $15 million in that range. So they're completely bite-sized projects. It's much easier to get that debt finance that we were talking about.
Yeah.
They've got working projects they can show the people, that debt providers, hey, this works. So it's not first of a kind already. And finally, that's so much more scalable. You can just punch out projects anywhere. You don't have to get all these things to come together to build a massive project, whether it's DAC or these BECCS, these bioenergy with carbon capture storage. So many things have to be perfect, and then you spend $1 billion. It's really hard.
Yeah. You've described your ideal founder archetype as a calm maniac. What does that mean, Matt? What is an example of a calm maniac that you've backed?
Yeah. Let me break that apart a little bit for you. Startups are so hard. And the maniacal piece of it is people just have to love what they're doing and have to be willing to go so hard for so long and see so many ups and downs, so many hard moments, so many times where they walk in and a key person quit or a project failed or whatever. And the sort of energy and resilience that it takes to get through that is what I'm talking about with the maniacal part. It's a special kind of person that will build that, especially a hard tech company, I think. It's fine that that's like 1% of the people in the world that want to do that. Those are the ones that I'm looking for. The grit, the resilience, the determination, the optimism, no matter what is happening. That's the maniacal part. But they have to be calm. They have to be a great people person. They have to roll with those punches and not get upset. They have to, I think, be easy to work with for their board and be a great communicator in the good times and the bad times. And they have to inspire other people through all that stuff. That's a huge amount of empathy and people skills and optimism and emotional management to not get upset and do the wrong thing with a partner who called and said they're going to, cut the order in half or can't deliver next week or something. There's just an enormous amount of emotional management skills that have to go along with that, I think, for a successful founder.
How do you test for that in the diligence process? Is that something you can even know before you make the investment?
No, I think that's partly why so many startups fail. You can't know it any more than you can know any of these other things, but I really try to get to know these people personally as humans because I think those are human characteristics. So I spend a lot of time with them and I get to know what their life is like outside of work. I actually kind of like it when a difficult conversation comes up during diligence, okay. Or maybe it's a difficult negotiation over a term sheet or something, because I get to see how do they act with me when things are hard, when we feel a little bit, I don't like what this person is saying to me. If we can get through that really easily, that's a great sign for me, that not because of how they got through it with me, but because of what that says about them and how they're getting through all those challenges with their team and their customers and their partners. The maniacal part's a little easier to see. You can just almost feel that in the room with one of these people, and you can see it in their interactions during the diligence and how quickly they respond and how intent they are in feedback. I mean, those kind of people are absorbing input and suggestion and needs like it's water, like a plant. You're watering a plant and they're just like, give me more that I can respond to build my company better.
Was there anything earlier in your career that resonates now with the companies you're working with?
So I grew up on a farm.
Yes, in Iowa. Wait, where in Iowa, by the way?
In Iowa, central Iowa.
Okay, I've been to Iowa City, but I've been in central.
Okay, Story County. My parents were the children of farmers. I think part of my appreciation for the founder journey and how difficult it is and how practical you have to be is formative moments for me were things like in a raging blizzard when a waterer for the cattle freezes up and the cattle are going to die if they don't have water. So it doesn't matter that it's 35 below in 40 mile an hour wind with the snow pounding, you go fix the waterer.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if you don't know how to fix it right now, you just figure it out. You keep trying because you don't have a choice, which is much like the founder's journey at many times. It's focused on practicality, one step at a time. If you don't know what to do, just do the next valuable thing that you can think of and never give up. And there was another piece of my father's wisdom that just cracks me up that I also think a lot about with founders too, which is there was a lot of chores, a lot of work to be done. And he used to say to us, if you're going to do something half-ass, just don't even bother starting. I think that's good advice. Yeah. If it's not important enough to do it really well, don't do it. Just stop.
So when these founders are starting multiple companies, maybe Elon notwithstanding, if they're starting a company and they're angel investing and they're doing all these things, is that a signal that they're not doing something?
Not necessarily if they can do all that well, but if they're not doing it well, if they're not able to carry through to the little things and do them well and with the same passion and energy and maniacal focus that they would bring to the most important thing, then they shouldn't do all those things.
Is there a question you find yourself asking often to founders at that stage where you're getting to know them and see if you want to commit to being a partner for a decade?
Why do you care? Why are you building it this way? Why did you start this business? What does this mean to you?
What's the answer that gets you to lean in versus lean out?
It's not so much the answer, it's their inspired passion about it. And for me, in my line of business as an investor, that's often has a piece of climate in it. It could be something happened in their family at some point that has inspired them. Kind of like a little bit of a chip on the shoulder. Maybe they were always underestimated and they really want to prove that wrong to the world or whatever reason. So it's that deep inspiration and belief in themselves and belief in their vision and their product.
10 years from now, when we look back, is there a consensus view in the world of venture and specifically climate investing that you feel like everybody holds today, they're going to be proven wrong?
I think I have a lot of those.
Please, let's go through them.
We do a lightning round. One is CDR. I think the world's going to have to do a lot of CDR, unfortunately. And I think we'll come around to that. It's not going to happen while Trump's still in the White House, unlikely, but I think we'll come around to that. A lot of things are going to force it. Rising seas, rising uncomfortable temperatures, the massive insurance crisis, which I think is only just beginning in the United States, and it's fire and heat driven in the West, and it's going to be water driven in a lot of places in the world, freshwater, drinking water, and it's going to be rising seas and flooding in a lot of places in the world. But people need to be able to insure their homes or they can't live. Our economy falls apart if real estate is uninsurable.
That's the thing that scares me the most. And I think I'm glad you brought that up, because to me, I think people start paying attention to these things when they become a part of the public conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And the fires in LA brought this back into really stark conversations. Why are insurance companies pulling out? Why are we not doing more, whether it's forest clearing or even just like climate resilience in these areas that we know burn every year at this point, right? It used to be every few years, and now it's like an inevitability. And how do we make these things less catastrophic?
That's right.
And we have a company, BurnBot, that we've invested in that like speaks to this topic.
I love BurnBot.
But it's been one of those, like, you kind of have to see it burn first.
That's right.
For then people to engage with a company like that. And I just wish it was preventative, not reactive.
I know. And I know for a fact there are Republican senators in the Western United States who share the views that we're expressing right now. And it's hard for them to speak up too much about it in this environment. But they are very concerned about drought, beetles, forest fire, many climate-driven cycles that are going to destroy the economies and just the way of life in their states. I mean, some of these Western states, it's like the outdoors it's their identity.
Yeah.
It's who they are. It's the people, and as well as the economies, the farming economies, the outdoor economies, the skiing economies, and so forth. Those things are going away if we don't reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. So, CDR.
Yes. Looking out in 10 years, what climate theme is deeply under-discussed today that you feel like looking back is going to be so obvious? For investors or just generally, we can talk from a public lens, public policy.
One thing that I think is probably way underestimated in the United States right now is EVs.
Okay.
So they're fundamentally better cars. They're fundamentally cheaper to maintain and cheaper to drive. And I think autonomy of all sorts, including in cars, is going to dramatically surprise us on the upside over the next 3 to 4 years of how fast it's going to go. Tesla and Waymo are obviously making a ton of progress. I actually think it's going to get easier and easier for a lot of fast followers to come really quick.
Yeah.
My oldest child is 10 years old. He's never going to have to drive. And with autonomous vehicles, that just pushes the economics so much more towards electric. You also have this massive EV industry in China and elsewhere. Once you know how to make batteries, it's cheaper and simpler to build an EV than it is a gas-powered car. And I think probably by the end of this decade, the United States automakers will do some combination of merging down to one company and federal bailouts.
Wait, say more about that. I mean, you feel like the traditional gas, even the ones that have gone hybrid, are challenged to that degree that they're going to have to do.
As autonomy takes hold and as China and elsewhere continues to make EVs cheaper and cheaper and the batteries continue to get better and better, the cars are going to be so much advantaged that no one will want a gas car. And if you don't own your car, or maybe you don't own as many cars at a minimum, you're not going to be as invested in driving a giant pickup truck because it makes you feel tough and cool.
Extrapolate that out, though, Matt. I mean, that means, entire economies and the landscape of towns change, right?
No.
You don't need an auto body repair shop. You don't need remanufacturers or repair. You don't need
gas stations.
You don't need parking lots because these things are always in motion.
That's right. This is why I think
changes the map of what we're looking at.
We're dramatically underestimating how this is going to affect society. The combination of autonomy and cheap EVs.
Wow. Yeah. Matt, you've operated at companies like Sunrun, Tesla, and Bloom. When you look at those experiences, how does that help you either choose or support founders at seed and Series A through their go-to-market and delivery product?
I think I probably rely on it more in the support than I do in the choose, although I would like to think that it gives me a little bit more of a capability to assess the founders' answers and skill sets in those various areas, because I've worn so many different hats. I've led sales, marketing, product, operations, all of these different things across the companies. But I think as a board member, one of my CEOs actually said this to me. She said, "You have great founder empathy because you've done all these things." So I like to talk to you about it because and part of it is empathy. It's on the emotional side, but part of it is just we can get into some level of detail about any one of those topics. Never the detail that founder would get into with her head of operations or head of sales. That's not the thing. But just be able to help her, in this case, think through, what should our management system be? How should we compensate? Do we push on this or that in operations? Frequently, I interview folks for my founders because they find the feedback useful. So it's just some level of having walked in people's shoes, you get a little bit more of a sense of what's hard and where the tricks are.
Yeah. How does meditation and your meditation practice show up when you're working and supporting these founders?
We recently did this great exercise at Prelude. We hired a personal development consultant, like a coach, to help the firm, to review the firm. And he suggested we do a process that he calls at my best. Rather than trying to create development plans that usually focus on all the things that you're bad at, he said, focus on the things, figure out what you're best at, and put more effort into using those skills more than trying to fix the things that you're bad at. Which made a lot of sense to me. So we went out and asked all kinds of people in our networks that we work with, founders, CEOs, fellow board members, fellow investors, even some friends, to fill out this thing of stories about us when we were at our best.
Okay.
And one of the themes that came back to me was empathy and kindness and honesty and directness. And I think those things come from my meditation practice, from having a good sense of balance and a good sense of these people are all humans. They're all just souls having an embodied experience here, trying to build a company that's going to bring some benefit to themselves and their employees, economically, to their investors, and to all of their customers and so forth. And I was just struck by how many of them said, "You're so honest, but you do it in a direct and calm way. You know, if I'm really stressed out, the person on my board that I'm going to call is you." There were lots of stories like that. And I think having that emotional balance and seeing people as humans is a really, maybe it's a skill set that's much more important than I knew it was until I read this stuff a few weeks ago.
Matt, that's actually a wonderful place to leave this conversation. I enjoyed so much starting big picture with you and really thinking through all the things that founders are grappling with today as they're building companies that are not just going to make a lot of money, but also make this planet more livable for our kids and the generations that come after. That's what keeps me going as we look at these companies. As I look at my son and I think about the world I want to leave for him, I'm just eternally grateful to the founders that do the hard work every day to make that world happen. So I want to thank you for investing in these companies, and I want to thank you for joining me on Climate.
Yeah, that was so well said. It is truly a pleasure and a privilege to work with these founders and work on these problems, and to have the opportunity to do something that's be so good for so many people and have that impact. It's a special thing.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.